Okay, welcome back. We are in early August 1866, and the last video then we left off in March of this year with military operations against the Austrian Empire having really ceased in a military victory. There is still no peace deal arrived at, but we continue our military occupation of the Austrian Empire, and we're still conducting counterinsurgency sort of small operations, for the most part in the east of the country. They're periodically kind of suppressed and then kind of recrystallize, and they're typically dealt with fairly readily and quickly. We control all of the major population centers of the Austrian Empire, all of the areas of kind of political significance, and I mean in terms of industrial significance, we've pretty much laid waste to the Austrian economy. Austrian armies that are visible to us, that is to say regular formations, not guerrillas, but for example in Germany, now seem to be merely shell formations that have been completely gutted. Of course, they can't get replacements or supplies or anything like this. So long term, they're facing extinction. And indeed, if we look at scores and objectives, and we look at the Austrian army, it's at sort of 0.31 of ours in terms of its overall combat power. Our combat power is now significantly ramping up because of the advent of new technologies. So, for example, the French army, still considered for this period the premier army in the world, is 1.5 of ours, so it's basically 1.5 times more powerful than ours in terms of its raw combat power. So, we're doing pretty well. We are going to maintain a military occupation of the Austrian Empire until we really arrive at a peace deal that we find acceptable. Either the Austrians offer us something that we find acceptable, or they accept one of our offers. It's a little bit of a risk. It is a gamble because, of course, it's there could be a change in the geopolitical situation. Prussia could become involved, or Russia, or something like this. I mean, Russia is already at war with Austria. But at the same time, we're 16 years into the campaign, and this is the third time we've fought Austria. Austria has proven to be a very belligerent power, and the second war with Austria was, as you'll recall, very, very touch and go. It was very, very close, very, very difficult. And had Russia have intervened during that war, we would, I think, almost surely have faced defeat. And we would have had to have probably given Bosnia, maybe more. We might have been forced to liberate Bulgaria or anything really. It's really hard to know. We'd have likely have had to given a large part of Eastern Anatolia to Russia and so on. So it could have been really, really messy. It could have been catastrophic. As it is, we fought an effective defensive war in Bulgaria, conducting judicious local counter-offensives. And we survived, and ultimately we forced them to the peace conference table. This third war, where Austria made a strategic mistake, they underestimated our power, our ability to conduct offensive operations, whilst at war with Russia. It's a narrow window of opportunity. We've managed to make the most of it. We seized Vienna, we've capitalized on that, and we now militarily occupy pretty much the entire Austrian Empire. We may never have this opportunity again. Furthermore, if we cut a deal where they give us reparations for 20 years, which they only pay for 5 or 6 years, we might find ourselves in a difficult situation some years from now. It would be some years, because even if we cut a white peace with Austria now, the Austrian army's been completely destroyed, so it'd have to be rebuilt from scratch. So we would have secured many years of peace, but we want more than that. We want to at least partially dismember the Austrian Empire. Probably we'd be looking at Hungary as our kind of main goal. Maybe Croatia or Montenegro, but one of the southern states that we can guarantee and we can kind of plausibly intervene to ensure that it enjoys continued independence, because we don't want it to be a temporary status. We want Austria to be critically weakened. Beyond that is the destruction of its army and the wholesale destruction of its productive forces. We want more than that. We want it to be territorially compromised, okay? And as such, we are going to maintain a military occupation. It seems, at times I've had a bit of fatigue and I've become frustrated and thought, God, this is unbelievable. But also, we're only really a year into a military occupation of the Austrian Empire. And if you look at the Franco-Prussian War, which is considered a fairly brief war, it dragged on for about a year. And I think Prussia controlled much of France before eventually arriving at terms, and France seceded sort of Alsace and Lorraine. So it's still a relatively short war, and there's a good chance that we'll be securing peace in the coming months. But our commitment to really forcing at least a partial dismemberment of the Austrian Empire remains ironclad. You see what I did there? Layered and textured. And that segues me a little bit into Italy, because the formation of an Italian state is now afoot. It's underway. A scripted event cropped up about a month ago where the Neapolitan kingdom of the Two Sicilies, which really is the southern Italian kingdom, plus the papacy, or the Vatican, or the papal states, plus the host of other principalities, fold themselves into the Italian state. They no longer exist as independent polities. As such, the areas of southern Italy are now Italian unless they are militarily occupied by an Austrian force that can maintain its presence there. We're already seeing with Naples, the Abruzzi, even Reggio, the Calabrian Peninsula, is coming under Italian control, and Italian control is partially being returned to Sicily. And now France was at war with the Neapolitan kingdom, not at war with Piedmont, Sardinia. As such, this area will naturally fall under kind of, unless any of these powers, Austria is of course, unless any of these powers are at war with Italy, the area will naturally move over to Italian control. So Italy is now going to be united. By the looks of it, they are of course still at war with Austria. Rather cleverly, they have positioned a force in Vienna, which means that when peace breaks out between us and the Austrian Empire, Vienna automatically comes under the control of the Italian state, which is interesting because that would immediately put Italy into a position to impose harsh terms on the Austrians themselves, which might mean, for example, they'd be forced to give up Verona, likely, maybe South Tyrol, maybe even Fiume and sort of Trieste or something like this. I don't know. But yeah, this could be interesting. Now, the formation of a single Italian state creates for us a maritime competitor. Of course, we do have maritime competitors in the Mediterranean. I mean, Britain is a sort of maritime hegemon during the period, but of course it has its resources spread over various theatres, but they're not really challengeable at sea for the time being. France is, to a lesser extent, but France is for the most part a Western Mediterranean power. In terms of naval power, they have a naval power that's 2.5 times larger than ours. We are, by the looks of it, we can't see the United States. I would probably suggest with a 4th naval power at the moment. Britain has a naval combat power that is 5.25 times larger than ours in terms of its raw combat power. That is spread over other theatres, however. Russia, in fact, may have a raw naval combat power that exceeds our own, but of course, again, Russian naval assets are spread into different theatres. Only a portion of that will exist in the Black Sea. So, the Navy is going to become increasingly a focus in the coming period. Now, in the last 16 years, the Ottoman Empire's principal military focus has been in expanding and modernizing our army. And we begin in 1850 with an army that is very new, it's very raw, it's an experimental army. The Nazim el-Jadid is kind of, adopting Western military customs that have become established in the Napoleonic War, the corps system, and all these kinds of things. But they're experimental formations, which is to say that we can't really actually create them. We don't have the technological capacity to create them because we don't have the technological capacity to systematically mass produce firearms, musket firearms. And I'm talking about muzzle-loaded muskets, the kind of muskets that would have existed in the Napoleonic Wars. We can create militia formations, so we can get access to a sort of hodgepodge of different irregular firearms, flintlocks, and this kind of thing. And that's the only kind of military formation, other than irregular forces, small irregular forces, that the Ottoman Empire can build in 1850 at the beginning of this period. In 16 years, we've significantly expanded our army. It's now probably 4 times larger than the experimental army of 1850, and it's really been the principal focus of our state exchequer. Most of the money that we've spent, probably more than a half, I reckon, has been in modernising and expanding the army, in conducting research and development to allow us to initially systematically mass produce muzzle-loaded muskets. That was the first branch of technology. And at the time, of course, the uniforms and everything didn't change because it was the army that we already had. It's just that we couldn't really build it. They were experimental formations. This allowed us to actually build Guard Corps, regular line infantry corps, and so on and so forth. The second branch of technology, which we focused on in the late 1850s, was muzzle-loaded rifles. Rifles, of course, being distinct from muskets because they have rifling in the barrel, which dramatically increases the range. Now, all of our formations would have had rifle detachments, rifle elements, light infantry, and this kind of thing. But it's only really with the Industrial Revolution and precision machining that we are able to research and develop systematic mass production of muzzle-loaded rifles. There's still sort of, the weapon is still loaded using fairly traditional means, using a ramrod and all this kind of thing. And that is still what most of our army is equipped with. And you can see that because one of the ways you can see what your army is equipped with is partly through raw combat power, but also, if we click on Guard Corps, we still have the 1850 to 1870 pattern for most of our Guard Corps, for example. You've got the sort of blue tunic and the red zouave style kind of, pantaloons. But we can see new formations. For example, in Basic Pasha's force, if we look at his Guard Corps, this is the new pattern uniform, 1870 to 1890, and that is because our most recent development is breech-loaded rifles. Breech-loaded rifles being a rifle being loaded much like a modern sort of small arm, loaded at the breech. I think initial cartridges were paper cartridges. Very quickly they became sort of metal cartridges. So in 16 years, we've gone from an army that really is armed with Napoleonic weapons, but we only have the ability to produce 18th century weapons, to an army that is among the first on Earth, really, to systematically introduce breech-loaded rifles. So we've gone from an army that has a Napoleonic character to an army that looks something like it would in the film Zulu, for example. The film Zulu is a really great exposition, of the devastating effect of kind of breech-loaded rifles that can be loaded very quickly at the breech, and of course increased range means that you get many, many more rounds off before you get kind of CQB, close quarter battle, hand-to-hand. Of course, hand-to-hand fighting always evens the odds, which means that if an army is larger than yours, even if it's technologically inferior, it can destroy your force. Now, a lot of our tactics throughout this period have relied on closing ground, melee. If you like, Omar Pasha probably laid the doctrinal and theoretical foundations for how our army is used. He was the first great general of the Nazi-Melchidid, really. He's the first general that develops the Nazi-Melchidid into a kind of an effective fighting force, really, and separates it from the old traditions of the Capiculu and the Janissaries and so on. And it does it to great effect. We win sensational victories over a poorly led Russian army in our first war. We defeat Austria in the second war, which is our first Austrian war, and he also leads a sterling defensive campaign in Bulgaria, which results in massive casualties for the Austrian army, relatively few casualties. We probably only sustain about 200,000 casualties in that war on our part, and force the Austrians to the peace conference table. And though he has not existed in this war, of course, he dies in the second war in the Battle of Kavala. He's been very much alive in spirit in terms of how our operations have been conducted. And of course, we now have a very experienced officer corps. What we haven't really looked at in the last 16 years is our navy. And that's partly because the Ottomans inherit a fairly decent navy in 1850. The Ottoman navy is relatively large. It's not massive, but it's the navy of a great power. And the Ottoman navy doesn't experience the same kind of decay as the Ottoman army, really. The Ottoman navy is producing triple-decker, kind of first-rate ships. It has experienced crews, and it's utilizing modern firearms properly, and perhaps it lacks some of the professionalism that you would find in, for example, the British Navy, the Royal Navy, or the French Navy, or whatever. But it's, for the most part, a pretty good navy. And it's reasonably large. It's probably the fourth or fifth largest kind of navy at the time. And that is really the limits of naval technology, save for things like professionalism, which we develop in the first few years. There's not much really. I mean, naval technology has not changed much in a kind of century and a half. And if you look at old kind of battles like the Battle of Trafalgar, some of the ships in the Battle of Trafalgar have been built 70 years before. They've been built by a different generation of people that were no longer around, and their first crews are no longer alive. These ships are very old. They last a very long time. And that's just because naval technology doesn't change very much. There's no need to decommission these ships. Naval technology are timber ships. They're sail powered, and they use cannons. Okay, the firearms probably that are on the ships, the weapon systems on the ships are gradually improved and this sort of thing. But there are no great changes. Now, of course, in the last 6 months, the Ottoman Empire has launched its first kind of industrial age ships. These are ironclads. They're ironclad gunboats. They're very, very small. They're like riverine ships, really. But they are really the first industrial age ships that we've built. And now, in the last 6 or 7 years, one of the branches of technology that we've funded, fairly consciously, is ironclad warships. We're also going to be looking at kind of like steam power, more effective use of steam power and this kind of thing. And that's because we are aware that as we enter into the 1860s, other powers are going to start developing ironclads and this kind of thing. I think the first ironclad was probably built by France in 1860. The second one, I think, was the Warrior. The British built one in 1861. But also in the American Civil War. At the same time, both the Union and the Confederacy are playing with very small ships that are similar to what we have just built. Quite small, kind of experimental prototype ships that are really just gunboats. And if you look at the kind of, I think the Union ship is a monitor, or maybe the Confederate one is. We don't have the capacity to build monitors yet. That's because we need to be able to build barbettes and rotating turrets. But these are the kind of ships that we've built, and we've built only 8 of them. We have another 4 in construction, I believe. I think, yeah, we've got another 4 in construction. But we've built 8 prototype, very small ironclad gunboats. This is just the beginning. To give you a sense of proportion, it's 1 ship per element in these squadrons and only 30 men a ship. But their combat value is, for example, 174. That's without experience, any kind of experience or really very effective training at this time, okay? If we look at the traditional Imperial Navy, a triple-decker ship of the line, its raw combat power is 203. And the crew of a triple-decker ship of the line is 1,000 men. You know, it's unbelievable. It's astonishing, really. If we look at, for example, steam frigate, the crew is 400. Okay, so at the moment it's very cost-effective. Of course, these things will become much, much more expensive. But these early kind of ironclad gunboats really are very, very small. They're quite cheap because they're, you know, but nothing can really sink them. It doesn't mean they can't be sunk, you know, like, I mean, crews can suffocate from cordite, gunpowder, recoil, they could develop leaks, they're probably not very well balanced, some of the engineering is going to be an awful lot of guesswork, so they might tip over and this kind of thing. And then also, a really large ship could just knock into them and sort of probably kind of capsize them, you know. So, they can be sunk, but they can't really be sunk using any of the firepower that exists at the moment. They're pretty much immune to firepower. They are the first tanks of the sea, and this is just the beginning. This is the beginning of the industrial age of sea. Now, beyond consistently funding research out of the state exchequer for kind of new kinds of maritime technologies, throughout the 1850s, we trickled resources into expanding our naval arsenal. So first of all, we built a large commercial shipbuilding plant, but we also increased the size of our docks. We've actually doubled the size of the naval base, which is in Galata. It's the old Genovese quarter in Constantinople, the Ottoman naval arsenal, but we've doubled the size of the arsenal. The reason being is that in real life, the Ottomans actually had a lot of ironclads, and the Ottomans had a massive navy during the 1860s, late 1860s, early 1870s. The navy was a bit of a kind of a hobby horse of Abdulaziz, our monarch. He loved the navy, he travelled to Britain and France, and he saw a lot of new ships, new kinds of technologies, and he wanted to have a really, really large navy. He felt that it was important for the prestige of the Ottoman Empire that they had a large navy, and also the newest kind of ships. And so about 2/3 of the ironclads that the Ottomans had, and they had a lot of ironclads, were bought from abroad, mostly from Britain, some from Prussia. What we've sought to do is to develop a domestic capacity to produce these new kind of ships fairly early on. And we've invested, therefore, into building up the naval arsenal in Constantinople, developing a burgeoning commercial ship plant in Constantinople, and also funding out of the state exchequer in our Academy of Sciences, consistently funding things like ironclad ships. Now, we do have one branch open, which is steam ship of the line. So we want to try and develop our ability to produce kind of steam power on the seas. The reason being is that's going to be really the key ingredient for having effective iron ships, because at the moment we do have steam power, but it's very modest. If we look at our ironclads, so this is really a shakedown. I wanted to move the ships, the ironclads. This is a brown water force at the moment. These are like river boats, so they really have to hug the coast, and you can see that it takes them with very, very basic kinds of like paddles or very basic steam power. The kind of screws, the systems that these boats are going to be using are very experimental. It takes them 24 days just to get into the northern Aegean. Okay, so sail power is still much more effective. We could get into the Aegean probably within a couple of days using the Imperial fleet. Let's have a look. You know, why can't the Imperial fleet? Oh, that's because we've got something being built in the Imperial fleet. Anyway, it's going to take them probably 5 days or a few days at most. Okay, so still these ships, you know, it's very early doors. They've got really good raw combat power. We don't want to just build hundreds and hundreds of these things because they're very quickly ironclads anyway are transitional. You know, they're a transitional stepping stone from pure the kind of you know, the kind of almost romantic, enchanted period of the Age of Sail, which is coming to an end, to the kind of ships that begin to predominate in the late 19th century and then into the early 20th century, up into the 1940s, really, which is the really big, large, steel, kind of like Leviathans, these huge kind of steel ships, you know. Beyond these gunboats are experimental. We'll have the ability to produce slightly larger, probably ironclads in the coming period, in the next 4 or 5 years, hopefully. Monitors and this kind of thing, but then ultimately in the 1870s we will have the capacity to produce ironclad frigates and corvettes, and that's the main thing, really. I mean, I don't think you really had ironclad triple deckers because it wouldn't have made much sense. It wouldn't have been very cost effective because an ironclad corvette or a frigate becomes almost a battleship, you know, because they're just not really sinkable. Well, they're very hard to sink, of course, until you have armor-piercing projectiles, more effective explosives, and this sort of thing. So that's going to be a focus, really. Now, in terms of our Academy of Sciences, we now are able to fund 4 independent branches of research and development. 3 of those are still on the Army, it has to be said. One of them is going to be upgrading our artillery arm. Now, artillery arm is going to be important for the Navy anyway, for fairly obvious reasons, but we still have bronze muzzle-loaded artillery, which is Napoleonic, really. Our artillery is beginning to fall behind. So we're going to have consistently, we're always going to have one branch open to expanding our artillery arm. In terms of small arms and infantry, all of the funding of the last 16 years has borne fruit. Our infantry is now going to be competitive, not least because it has a very experienced kind of high command. We know how to use our army quite effectively now, but its technology is going to remain competitive for many decades from now. Or breech-loaded rifles, I beg your pardon, is the beginning really for modern firearms, and we've got that down. We can domestically produce that. We're going to start looking at other areas now: organizational, institutional things, military staff system, reserve formations, professionalism, other parts, you know, professionalism within the officer corps. We're going to sort of try and systematically build on the gains that we've made, because for the most part our threats are still going to be land powers, and our army still does lag behind in some areas like reserve formations. We've seen that with the war with Austria, that they're able to rustle up massive amounts of reserve formations and put them into the field. But we are going to start building on maritime technology. So once the next army technology is completed, which is probably going to be, well, it's probably going to be military staff system, because iron muzzle-loaded artillery will lead immediately probably into steel breech loaders or something like this. So we're going to keep a line open. So once military staff system is complete, probably in the next couple of years, next year or two, we're going to open up iron ships, rifled guns, these kind of things, and gun turrets and this sort of thing. We're going to systematically expand our research and development for the Navy. And one of the reasons for that is because, well, Italy is now it's on the cards. Italy is going to form as a serious Mediterranean power in the coming years. Italy's going to be a competitor. Italy's going to be coveting, for example, Tripolitania and Cyrenaica. The Italians named it Libya to give it a kind of Romanesque name, but it's actually 2 territories. The Italians are going to be competing with France over Tunisia. We might also intervene. Now, we have some presence in Tunisia. We've done this really to stop the French getting full protectorate of colonial status, because we didn't really want to border with France. So we've really done this to kind of slow down the process of French colonial moves. The French are now building a military outpost in Tunis. That does change the game a little bit. So the French are now making a serious play. Even the Russians have actually made a landing in Bizerte. This is going to be temporary. I think the Russians have really just had a bit of a kind of toehold in Tunisia, maybe as a kind of a stopping off point in their journey to Sevastopol or Odessa from the north, from Murmansk or St. Petersburg. But the French and Italians are going to be competing over this. We might also get involved in that. That probably would mean war with France, but at the right time, not now, that might not be the worst thing. Because, of course, we don't have claims on any French territory, but we could force France to secede, or not to secede, so actually give us colonies. So that's something we should bear in mind. A united Italy will also mean much more robust competition for the Horn of Africa. And we relish that. We don't mind having a kind of great power competitor, but we absolutely intend to be the power that acquires the Horn of Africa, not Italy. And we, in years to come, we might be happy to come to blows over that question. So, the Navy all the way, really. But yeah, again, because Italy, because of France. If this most recent war has proven anything, it's that the Ottoman Empire, I think it's stopped its period of decline. I feel like we've got a second wind in history. Austria feels like the sick man of Europe, and we can definitely pack a punch. That means that we can start looking at things like re-establishing ourselves in the old kind of Eliates and sort of in North Africa. Morocco has not yet been colonized. It is merely, I think its colonial status is a Prussian-influenced territory. The Prussians in real life did have an interest in Morocco. This was a kind of crossroads for Spain, France, and Prussia. France ultimately wins the game, I think, in the 1890s. But, we could also look at Morocco at some point. Priority remains, of course, the Arabian Peninsula. We're now working towards full colonial status. For Dubai. Dubai will be a colony in the next fortnight. Qatar is a colony. Next up is probably going to be Aden. And then we're going to be looking at a fairly sustained pacification campaign in the kind of the provinces outside Medina, really, to drive up colonial penetration on the Hejaz. I still think that the Hejaz can be made a full colony between now and 1870. It's going to require a lot of resources, but it's doable. Now, one thing that has changed a little bit in terms of our economy is we're beginning to see the first signs of inflation. Only 1%. We have seen a 16-year period of really, really sustained growth and almost zero inflation throughout that entire period. 1% is not alarming. The main basis for that is, of course, two things. One is the gold mechanism. Now, we have intentionally, for about nearly a decade now, or maybe slightly less, about 7 years, we have been importing huge amounts of gold and not really making it that available on the domestic market for sale. So we've been stockpiling gold and allowing that to convert private capital into state revenue. In addition to that, we have had a constant and increasingly large flow of diamonds from the Persian Gulf. Now, once we absorb Qatar, once that becomes a colony, all of the wealth and the commodities held by the ruling elite in Qatar becomes commodities within the Ottoman Empire. This fully absorbs every part of the Qatar. So that the tribal leaders, some of the tribal leaders might become state officials within the Ottoman Empire, but we also actually simply implant our own kind of system. We have a governor's residence. We have someone there that is now administering that region. When that happens, any kind of state revenue and private capital that exists in that region is absorbed by your exchequer and is absorbed into your ruling elite. The other thing also is commodities. So that's resulted in a large influx, for example, of diamonds. Instantly we went from about 3 or 4 to about 10 or 15. That'll also be the case with Dubai. And we have made diamonds almost completely unavailable in the domestic market for sale. I think it's sitting around 5% availability. Let's have a double check. It's an inorganic commodity. Yeah, so out of all of the diamonds in a given fortnight, 4 units are converted into state revenue. 1 unit is sold on the domestic market for private capital. The reason we did this is because we have a fairly robust and growing economy. We didn't want to do this in such a way that it kind of slowed the growth of our economy or impeded its growth, but to allow the state to benefit from that as much as possible, so that we can kind of plow a lot of that wealth into research and development for our army, but also the expansion of our army, and also paying for kind of colonial projects. So it's allowed the Ottoman state to punch much above its weight. And in some measure, the purpose of this is to offset or mitigate the relative ineffectiveness of our bureaucracy when compared to countries like France or Britain. So the relative backwardness of our, and like the lack of education, our inability to kind of recruit large numbers of educated, literate civil servants, a full autocracy, all these kind of things. This is offset and mitigated a little bit because, of course, you need a really large, effective civil service to much more efficiently collect tax. We can collect tax, but it's relatively inefficient compared to a country like Britain or Prussia or France or the United States of America. So we offset that through the gold mechanism and also through diamonds. Specifically, not by making private wealth out of those things, but converting that to state revenue. That does, over a period of time, incur inflation. Inflation It's okay if it's between 1 and 3%, I would say, as a rule of thumb. 4% is not too bad, but 1, 3, maybe 4%, or 2, 3, 4%, these are within the kind of okay, you know, sort of comfortable areas. Once you get to about 4%, you've got to be a little bit careful, because economic growth, if it goes through a bit of a flat period, or you go into an economic crisis, which will add inflation to that, it can add 3 or 4 points to that, you can very quickly find yourself 6, 7, 8, 9% inflation. If your economy is not growing at that rate a year, what you're really seeing is driving costs. That, especially for the state, it means it's much more expensive to recruit armies and all these kinds of things, to import goods. So we want to be really, really careful there. We don't want to drive inflation. I have kind of slackened off gold import a little bit. As soon as I noticed that inflation had gone up, which was straight away, I slackened off a little bit. And over a period of time, maybe a few months, that 1% might even drop off. But if it holds for a few years, that's fine too, you know. But we want to be careful, because it means that if we continue importing gold at that rate, it will drive inflation. The gold mechanism and diamond conversion is absolutely zero-sum also for our research and development. Without research and development, the Ottoman Empire will be far, far behind other powers. This enables us to be militarily competitive, and that's going to be a key thing. So no matter what happens during this period, no matter how advanced Britain becomes, or how sophisticated the kind of education systems develop in Northern Europe, we can maintain, you know, we can retain the basic character of our empire, which we will by default. We can retain all of this, and we can kind of offset it, really. A good example of this would be a place like in the modern period would be a place like Saudi Arabia, you know, which in a lot of ways is obviously very backward institutionally, but through the kind of export of gold and through the state kind of siphoning off some of that, it could build very, very modern kind of like, you know, sort of infrastructure projects. I mean, even actually modern day Dubai is a great example of that. I mean, Dubai during this period, we have to keep in mind, is an absolute kind of like, you know, there's nothing there. It's sort of really just a handful of small settlements. And indeed, Dubai, even in the 60s and 70s, was not much different from what it is now, frankly. In the 1860s, Dubai, as we understand it today, is a metropolis that is built out of nothing. So we're sort of doing that a bit with diamonds and gold. We're converting some of our private, you know. You can see a little bit of Russia in the modern period also with its armed forces. It's sort of the state involvement in the oil industry allows it to kind of maintain a large armed forces and this sort of thing, despite having a fairly modest gross domestic product. So anyway, that's kind of what we're doing. Of course, the oil, you know, we're also well placed to make a lot out of oil many decades from now, probably the beginning of the 20th century or maybe the late part of the game. But diamonds and gold is going to provide us with a basis for research and development and to maintain a large army. That's pretty much it. In terms of the an update report then for early August 1866, that's pretty much it. That covers everything. I'll continue to treat this, even though we are technically at war with Austria, and even though small military operations are being conducted, I think for the most part we're going to conduct this as a kind of peacetime period. So the next report, unless there's a big battle or a significant development, something that is worth reporting on, I'll probably leave it a couple of months. So it's early August now. Maybe the next report will be a winter report or an autumn report or something like that. So that's it. We'll probably see you again in maybe October, November or December 1866. Unless peace breaks out. If peace breaks out, I will do a video where we can talk about the terms that have been arrived at and what that might mean. But yeah, thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one.